Hello, my friends, and it's good to see you once again. We got some pretty interesting stories for you this week. So last week we talked about the digital AIs that are coming to the UK. Now, whether or not that actually happens, that can change. You know, granted, the deadline is 2029. Pardon me for hitting my mic, but it'll be interesting to see how accurate that prediction is going to be. With that being stated, the thought that comes to my mind right out of the gate is the obviously data has to be stored somewhere, okay? And how do I want to say this? I don't know if a lot of you nice folks remember several years ago, but there was all this hype around the cloud. And the biggest cloud service that I know of is AWS services, which is Amazon Web Services. And believe it or not, Amazon does not get to be as big as Amazon is currently through just the marketplace, the Amazon marketplace. They actually sell AWS services, and that's the bulk of their profits right there. And most of the world's biggest websites, unless they're self-hosted, like I know Google has their own data centers, Meta has their own data centers, but you know, pretty much anybody who doesn't want to deal with the infrastructure, they tend to go with AWS services. Not to say that that's bad. There's quite a lot of advantages that come from hosting on the cloud. With that being stated, that's one option that you have available to you. The other option is through, again, self-hosting, which is what the South Korean government did. And I don't know if anybody here has heard the news, but their data center, the government data center, actually caught fire due to a lithium-ion battery issue when they were doing some maintenance on a computer. So we're going to talk about the fallout and why this is important, at least, again, with digital ID. And this is kind of what nobody's really talking about regarding this is, again, all that information has to be stored somewhere. And I don't know what is going to fully go on with the digital ID, but, you know, there has to be a place where, like, if you get a new phone, you have to download that information. You know, and that information has to be stored somewhere. So basically your whole life has to be stored somewhere. And then there's no real, like, I just don't think the whole thing was really thought out. I'm sure that, you know, there's government think tanks out there thinking about how this is going to work out and all that stuff. Maybe, you know, this whole video is moot, but let's talk about it. So the fire hit their storage center, and the problem is they only got the one storage center, and they have 858 terabytes worth of data, which in the grand scheme of things is not much if you really think about it. But when it comes down to paperwork, that's quite a bit of information gone. And when I say gone, there's no recovery about it whatsoever. So the issue here is the South Korean government had what's called G Drive, which is not connected to Google in any way. Like, G in this case means government drive. And it's basically a cloud drive. Everybody had about 30 gigs worth of storage, right? So right here, in fact, here it is right here. G Drive, which stands for government drive rather than Google, stored data for around 125,000. 125,000. Keep that in mind. Federal workers, government workers, whatever you want to call them, who were allowed 30 gigs each, and the core and was core to 163 public facing services. Pardon me. So basically, 163 government systems went down. because of this fire. I really want everybody to think about that. 163 systems. Could you imagine? We'll take America for example, since I'm sure most of my audience is American. Could you imagine if your car record, not your driving record, but your car record gone. If you're trying to get on Social Security disability, all that information's gone. So you got to start that whole process over again. If you're involved in the immigration system, that could lead you to facing deportation, which I know that's a hot topic issue. There is legal immigration as of right now, and I'm strictly talking about legal immigration. Or let's just say, there's a murderer out there who's facing trial and all the evidence that was digitized is gone because they were heavily emphasizing that government employees store or digitize all that information and then store it on the G drive. So now an accused murderer has to be let go because all that evidence is possibly gone. All that work gone. So again, we'll talk about it real fast. On September 26th of this year, technicians were relocating lithium-ion batteries in the NIRS data center, which stands for National Information Resource Service. Okay. 40 minutes later, the batteries exploded, causing the blazing inferno. And for anybody who hasn't watched the batteries that exploded on those airlines, those videos, they were pretty energetic, I will say. Just go online and watch a lithium-ion. In fact, in my job, I've exploded lithium-ion batteries just out for the fun of it, and it is pretty intense, the reaction that comes from it. So according to this, the fire raged for hours. Fortunately, no one was killed, thank God. That's basically the problem. And again, the services that they reference here, it was holding everything from import and export certifications to product safety checks, according to the reports. Which again, that's that could mean a lot of things. The big issue here, and this is what everybody's talking about, and this is why I think that this is going to be a big deal going down the road, is G Drive did not have a backup, which when it comes to online systems, live systems, whatever you want to call it, the industry standard is you're supposed to have a 3-part system. You're supposed to have, an online backup, an offline backup, and physical storage. And what they mean by physical storage is like magnetic tape versus like a drive. Data storage and data recovery is probably one of the biggest blind spots a lot of these industries have that they're not addressing. And if this is the South Korean government, which I would argue is very technologically savvy compared to some other national governments out there, I can only imagine what would happen if the British were to do a digital ID system. In fact, this thought just came into my mind. There was not a data center, but a warehouse, paperwork warehouse that burned here in the U.S. Several years ago, that stored military records for service members who've been discharged. And a lot of those records disappeared. In fact, I'm not ex-military, but one of the things that anybody who's in the service would tell you is always copy and save copies of every single paper you're given, all your sick call slips, all your discharge paperwork, every little bit of information that they give you, because they tend to lose paperwork, they tend to misplace paperwork, all that stuff. At least you'll always have a copy of that record. and there have been instances where, you know, people have gone through, like, say, the Veterans Administration system where, you know, they end up losing out on really important disability needs because it's not, the government has declared it not service connected when it really was. You know, in fact, you know, there's always the issue of Agent Orange, and then there was the Camp Pendleton water poisoning situation, asbestos exposure, and then the most recent one that I can think of was the 3M ear protection. Apparently, it didn't work that well, and it led to hearing loss for everybody. There's always lawsuits coming out with the government, and you know, you should always keep your paperwork. Anytime you go to the doctor, anytime you do whatever, you should always get a copy for your records, download it, put it in a file cabinet somewhere. Get yourself a file cabinet, because this stuff can happen. Always have a backup of your paperwork. So it says here, G Drive was not backed up. Let's see here. About 858 terabytes of data was lost. 95 other systems in the fire were also destroyed, but they were backed up. So, I like I said, I was told in other articles and listening to the news that G Drive was more of just like a general dump for employees. So if they were working on paperwork or whatever, it was stored on that. According to NIRS, the National Information Resource Service, of the 647 systems at the Daejeon headquarters, 62% were backed up daily, but the remaining 38% were backed up once a month. As, you know, kind of a context there. You know, some systems were backed up last on August 31st. I don't know if those backups are tested. That's the other issue when it comes to data recovery, is a lot of times they don't test the backup systems or the backups that they made, and then when they try to bring live those backups, for some reason they end up failing. You know, be it data corruption or whatever, and then the backups are basically worthless. You know, I've heard instances of where companies had to go back 6 months, you know, and that's like 6 months where they don't have records of your purchases or whatever, you know, all that information gone as if it didn't exist. And this is, you know, what's scary about this. You know, I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit here, but what's scary about all this is a government. And like I said, South Korea is one of the most technologically savvy governments out there. Their whole country is awash in free public Wi-Fi. You know, you can't go anywhere in South Korea and not experience Wi-Fi. That to me is stunning. That they felt that a once a month backup was okay for these systems. You know, the fact that they didn't have a second storage somewhere else. I mean, granted, you know, this only started in 2017, but still, you know, they never thought for 1 second that this place would just go up in smoke. Well, obviously they did now because it just happened. Here's a good one. The incident affected government services, including tax filings and workers' emails. Think about that. What if, you know, you're trying to sue the government and the evidence that you're relying on, their emails, which by law is supposed to be kept on record, vanishes in smoke. Now your case is done because you can't prove that they're at fault for something. Unbelievable. If there was a FOIA request, it can't be honored because of something like this. The incident affected governments. Pardon me, I already just read that. Restoring the services have been slower than expected, with less than 20% back online a week after the fire. Several government services are expected to be offline for up to a month. And I know over in Asia, it's not really prevalent here, but over in Asia, they have these apps that are kind of like a dual app. WeChat is apparently one of them, where it started as a text service, and now it's like you can do text, you can do money transfers, you can pay. Like there's places in like Beijing that you can't even use money at anymore. You have to use a service like WeChat to pay just for a bottle of water, and that's why the whole social credit system is so problematic. Is a lot of their citizens are going homeless because they got poor social credit score, and they're getting locked out of things like bank accounts through WeChat. In fact, they're locked out of WeChat altogether. So they're homeless because they just can't participate in society. And I would like to talk more about that. I just don't know how we're going to do it, but we'll figure it out. And in fact, even though no one was directly killed in the fire, someone did self-delete. They jumped out of the 15-story window, and he just couldn't handle the pressure from what was going on. So that's the whole article right there. But again, this brings up a lot of questions in my mind as to what the infinite possible shortfalls of a digital ID or a digital currency system could happen. Because, the whole point of Bitcoin is, the ledger. And the ledger shows who got what Bitcoin at what time and all that stuff, right? And that's public information. Well, I shouldn't say public like, you can just go look at it. It's if you get involved with Bitcoin, one of the things that you have to do is download that ledger, and you store it on your PC. In fact, I have a copy of it on my PC. It's extremely out of date, simply because I haven't dealt with Bitcoin in since 2017, I think. But like, obviously, if like a payment system for a digital currency were to go down in a fire like this, and it would take a month to recover, could you imagine not being able to do commerce for a month? Could you imagine not being able to do certain basic functions that, paper currency and a cash register can handle no problem? I mean, it's already bad enough. Like in my industry, if one of my machines goes down, a store can't function. Like they legitimately can't take cash at all. And people, believe it or not, really get upset when a store cannot give cash when they request cash back. Or they get really upset because they can't pay with cash and they have to leave and go to another store. And it's not just like if you're trying to buy something, like if you're trying to send money to a relative outside of like PayPal or something, it's very disruptive, and that's just one store. Now imagine like a whole chain of stores going down at one time, or, an entire region going down at one time. Like I said, the questions that pop into my mind goes really south really fast. And with everything becoming AI connected in some capacity, like we're going to do a story here in a bit about the AI readers at Hertz. What happens if you can't return a car at Hertz, and now you're subject to a fine from Hertz because you can't return the car because the AI scanner's down? Like, where does it end? Everything is connected. I get that. But when it comes to connection, it becomes a chain. And if one chain is broken, the whole system fails. Same thing with like security breach. We're going to talk about a security breach here today too. You guys will probably experience it later on down the road. But, what happens when my information, Equifax, that's a really good example. Equifax, they had that data breach and everybody got hacked basically. I never wanted to participate with Equifax, but I have to for some ungod reason, because my credit score is basically who I am as a person, and my whole life revolves around my credit score. Everyone sits there and talks about social credit score. Well, we already have technically a social credit score. It's the credit score. If you don't pay your bill, you get deducted, and then what happens when their systems are hacked? Well, now all my social security information is out there, my personal address information is out there, everything about me is out there without my consent. And now my emails are so chock full of spam that I can barely function because of all the emails. My phone is ringing 24/7 nonstop because of all the scam calls from India and Pakistan and wherever else in the world trying to get me to send them gift cards in Bitcoin. Or otherwise I go to jail, even though it's obvious that they're not American. I'm personally getting sick of it. I've been getting sick of it for a while, but like this whole data center fire, when I found out about it last week, was more just like, this is really bad. Anyways, so my point in all this is, the government has to make a decision, and I think, the UK, they'll have to build some kind of data center or something for the digital IDs. They can't store it online in AWS or whatever, because again, if it gets hacked, you got problems. And I think that's where all this is going to go. Is it's not a question of if it gets hacked. Really, the question is, when is it going to get hacked? And it's either going to be sooner or later, or it could, they could build up a server farm and then it all goes up to smoke. So we'll see. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video. Like I said, it's a little more, or a little less polished, a little more rough. Well, I work on some things on the background. I'm just trying to get content out there. So I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for being here. I hope you have a great day.